We're super happy to see all of you here from different faculties from everywhere. We're very happy to host you at the campus for our Professors versus Student debate. To kick off, I would like us to all put our hands together for our professors and our students debating today with us. Please, a round of applause. Okay, we might need to retry that one more time. A round of applause. A quick brief word to the topic itself. Of course, wars are ubiquitous in the news right now. We cannot help but get around it every time we open them. And the question of justice when it comes to war is a difficult one, and especially when it comes to preventive wars. There's been multiple indications in the past. And today we get together at the Faculty of Social Sciences to debate, are preventive wars just?
Yes, hello everyone. When we first started this club 2 years ago, we wanted exactly what we have in front of us right now. We wanted a room full of people hungry for a political discourse. This space did not exist for us, for students of politics, philosophy, and economics before, at least not to this extent. And so, with the hard work and dedication of myself and my amazing colleagues, Lisa Weilig, Nia Nitze, Lev Levin, Maxim Lokhaczewski, and Medina Lizada, we made it possible. My name is Emilia Bogdanovic, and I'm the founder and president of the PPE Debate Union, and it is of the utmost pleasure today that I welcome you all to our event. Today's special. It represents the bridging of international Czech students and professors, and we hope that this debate suits you and prepares and kind of sets a benchmark for collaborations between Czech and international students. And we think this is of the paramount importance to foster. I think all of the familiar and unfamiliar faces who are here with us today, and academics and students, I thank all the professors and students who took their personal time off to prepare for this really interesting debate. And just in general, you can see today the amount of work that was put into this. It was months of work. And ever since we started doing this 2 years ago, it's always been continuous. Continuity was a key for this club to become something, and we did start from scratch. And so this is why I'm especially grateful that I'm sharing the stage here one last time, because this is our final debate with my colleagues and with the Czech colleagues as well. Professors versus students is our format. Oxford is the style of debating, and you guys will be crucial to determine the winner via the QR code later on. Food is provided as well in the end, so stay tuned for that. Mia spent a lot of hours trying to put together the boards and everything. And just a little reminiscent moment right now. At the PPE Debate Union, we've gathered over 200 people, both academics and students, to be part of our debates, both bi-weekly and in grand ones like this one. And we work tirelessly to create the network that we have right now, not only with PPE and other FSCs such as the BK Club here, but also with the Debatní Club of the Faculty of Law. And I'm sure that me and my colleagues have created something that's gonna surpass our time spent at this university. I would love for that to happen, for this club to still be alive when we graduate and everything. And I encourage, for all the PPE students that are here today with us, I encourage all of you to be a part of this club. Whether you're into logistics or marketing or PR, or just want to get rid of stage fright, or want to learn how to reasonably argue, I promise you this is the club for you. For those of you who are veterans, quote unquote, in our debates, welcome back, and thank you for the trust and loyalty. And for those of you that I see for the first time, I hope we catch your attention. My name is Emilia Bogdanovic, and it was a pleasure leading this club. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is David. I'm head of the academic section of PK, the Political Science Club here in Fusela. I was let about the speech like 5 minutes ago, so we'll probably not be as prepared as the previous one. But firstly, I would like to introduce a bit PK. We are a student club here at the Institute of Political Science. We've been for the last 15 years, and we have many debates and other events for both our professors, our students, and people outside of the academic. So that's about us. I would like to thank all of you to come here to this debate. I would like to thank the PPE Debate Club for organizing this debate with us. I think it's great that all of you came to something that is really pretty new for us. We never did this style debate that we are doing today. So again, it's something new for us, and we are very excited for it. And I would also like to thank all the professors and the students that came here today to debate. And yes, so I would like to thank all the participants, and I hope this debate will be great.
One last thank you to the Colloquian for filming this. This debate will be uploaded on YouTube and be able to be watched in the future. And without further ado, enough from us. You came here to see a debate. That's what's going to start now. Thank you very much for your attention and have fun.
Hello, everyone. I'm Medina Alozada. I'll be the chairperson for this debate. Unfortunately, Maxime is unable to join me today, so I'm doing this on my own. Don't judge me too much. I'm trying my best. And without further ado, I'd like to proceed with the debate rules and etiquette. We value evidence and accuracy for all arguments to be verifiable. We also present points of information in case any of the debaters have gone over time or have overgeneralized their responses, or if the microphone wasn't audible enough. The same applies for the audience. House consistency for the teams to not switch on their original stances. And the important notes is that I have absolute authority throughout the procedure. And if I deem for the time to be exceeded or cut, that is entirely up to me. Moving on to the general conduct. We want respectful discourse, no interruptions, to stay on topic, provide fact-based argumentation, respect the questions of the audience, no disruptions from the audience. So we kindly ask you to be quiet throughout the debate. And please do not ask offensive or irrelevant questions. As for the structure of the debate, we will have our initial audience vote in a second, the introduction, then we'll have the first speakers of both houses, second speakers of both houses, third speakers of both houses. Then you will get a chance to see them rebuttal throughout the 20 minutes. They will ask each other questions in order to dig up into their arguments, or perhaps ask something that they delivered or something that was unclear or needs to be fact-checked or verified. And then you, the audience, will get the chance to ask questions. I do encourage you to ask a specific house or touch upon a specific point that was mentioned during the debate, or the questions to not be too general. However, if you do have a general question, you're also more than welcome to ask it. At the end, we'll be closing the debate with you voting, and whichever house you vote for will win. I do ask you to vote for the house that you believe delivered better arguments, rather than necessarily stating your position in this, because your initial vote will be regarding your initial position for the motion proposed. Without further ado, I would like to proceed with the QR code. A quick disclaimer, as the debaters ask what they're going to argue in favor, or does not necessarily mean they support that. It's just for the sake of the house. So we'll do the display on for now, and we'd like to proceed further. If you still wish to vote, the display is open. If you save the QR code, we'll be moving onward with the first speaker of the affirmative team pending purposely.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to everyone who is spending their Wednesday here. The question, is preventative war just, draws on a tradition of just war that goes back to Augustine. And it's really asking, is preventative war part of that tradition? That is a normative question. And we will later on talk a little bit about the normative aspects. But I want to point out what's being smuggled into the question, which is that there are wars that are entirely justified. And the tradition of just war is a project to take the killing of other people and to make it legitimate, to make people who participate in it feel like they're doing something good, and to rationalize it. And as such, I think we need to start off by thinking of just war, not as a philosophical argument, but as a mode of genre creation. War is a story. And war as a story gets told with good guys and bad guys, with heroes and villains. And all of that story is meant to have what is called an affective response, to make us feel a certain way, to make us feel that this thing that is done, which is the murder of people, is an acceptable approach. That is, to say something is just, is to say, it's a good thing to do. And so we are arguing that preventative war is exactly as just as defensive war or as reactive war, which is to say it's participating in this narrative. And it's participating in the building of a narrative that is best explained not through some sort of objective ethical project, which admittedly was what just war theory was set up to do, to say, all right, this is what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, something that's called jus ad bellum, which is why can you go to war? It's not doing that as much as it is telling us a story as to why it's all right to celebrate the death of people. In order to understand it, then, I think we need philosophy. We need politics, but we also need to understand literature. We need to understand psychology. We need to understand affect. To think of war as a genre is to think about the way in which stories about war are told, to recognize that people who go to war usually feel justified in it. They're saying, we are doing this for very good reasons. We're doing it because we have no other option. We're doing it because this is the world we live in. And that to talk about wars as justice is to participate in them. In fact, this educational process, what you're here for now, what you're majoring in, is part of teaching you how to do that, to participate in that narrative. I will spend the last 20 seconds by pointing out that of the contemporary just war theorists, for example, Michael Walzer is probably the best known one, who wrote a book called Just and Unjust Wars. After the events of October 7th, he, for example, said, well, what Israel does for military reasons, that is just. What it does for political reasons, that is unjust. And we can tell the difference that way. I think that argument, while I understand it, is fundamentally laughable. This idea that you can tell the difference is wrong.
Thank you very much. We're going to move with the first speaker of the negative house.
Thank you very much. War brings an untold amount of suffering and cruelty. Can waging it purely on speculation be ever just? This is not a story, this is real suffering that we will be talking about. And we will illustrate in this debate very clearly that preventive war is not the same as defensive war. Indeed, we will be talking in my speech primarily about the normative aspect. Firstly, we have to establish what just actually means. And for that, we will firstly show three broadly agreed upon principles which are considered as just, and show how the very notion of preventive war directly contradicts them. But suppose the affirmative house will be able to prove, for example, that you as the audience should not care, for example, about just war. We say okay to that, because aside from the principial just war stance, which we will illustrate to you, we will also show you how preventative war is unjust based on its consequences. So let's get to the normative discussion. Firstly, the first principle, consider a people's right to self-determination and free pursuit of development of their resources. Now consider Israel bombing Iraq's nuclear reactor Osirak in 1981 because they said it posed a threat, bombing it as prevention. Under the doctrine of preventive war, even a pursuit of clean energy can become a threat and can be a reason to wage war. We do not believe that is just. But suppose we didn't buy this argument. Let's move to the just war theory. We do believe there is merit to the just war theory. Those are the very principles set up to minimize aggression, to make wars as humane as it is possible, despite all the consequences. That is why I believe it is important to remind ourselves why preventive war is not in line with it. Firstly, just war clearly mandates that war is used to be as a last resort. Preventive war is by very definition against that, because preventive war means striking against only a potential threat somewhere in the future. There's still a lot of steps to take other than war when it comes to prevention. You can do deterrence, you can do diplomacy, you can do other things. Secondly, use ad bellum mandates having a just cause, such as re-establishing a just peace. Yet under the doctrine of preventive war, the cause is a hunch, a speculation. Even in good faith, a state can never be 100% sure that another country does pose a threat, in fact. So we ask you, did 100,000 Iraqis have to die in 2003 and onwards because somebody in the USA speculated that Iraq may possess weapons of mass destruction? Was it just? We say no to that. But let's say that we do not want to talk about principles. Sure enough, let's evaluate the justice of preventive war on its consequences. Do those justify it? Let us imagine a world where there is a rule, moral or legal, that preventive war is justified. Would that be a better world? Of course. Doctrine of prevention would lower the threshold to violence. It would make it a routine. It would normalize it. It would solidify hostilities. We will expand on this also in our further speeches. Doctrine of preventive war would allow all the hostile countries currently to attack each other. And we do not think that under such consequences, preventive war can ever be considered just. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be moving to the second speaker.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to start by thinking if we actually think that war theory itself is just, then we need to live in the real world and the geopolitical situation that entails. And first of all, I want to distinguish that this is different to the current ongoing events in Iran or Iraq in 2003. Those are specific examples of interventions which are not falling within a specific framework of justifiable, just preventative war. Now, a state's first priority is to its citizens to provide safety. And to do this, on occasion, you may need to preventatively strike first. I give the example, if we look at World War II and Pearl Harbor, should the US have had credible intelligence that Japan was imminently going to attack Pearl Harbor, they would have as obligation to their citizens to attack preventatively and that way deter the aggressions. You should not have to incur civilian casualties before you are allowed to defend yourself in such an instance. Next, I want to talk about if we actually look at the scope. If you actually react, often cases, the results are much worse than if you acted in advance. And for that, I want to bring about a relevant example in Rwandan genocide, 1994. Now, what happened in Rwanda in January? The Canadian general in charge of the UN command for the peaceful transition of power in Rwanda basically said that there was a genocide imminently and they needed to intervene with a foreign force. Did that happen? Obviously not. And the results, 800,000 minimum to 2 million casualties, all civilians slaughtered in the streets. Is that just? I do not think so. The UN lessons learned from that resulting event was twofold. First of all, that the principle of the responsibility to protect doctrine means that you have the duty as another state to intervene in that case. And secondly, that there is no justification around sovereignty allowing impunity from specific external action.
Thank you very much. We're moving to the second speaker of the negative house.
All right, thank you. So actually, I want to talk about the deeper issue here behind the words preventive I want to talk about how actually this really depends on narrative construction. How a lot of times, first of all, states may first describe a supposed threat in the future, label it existential, and then present the aggression as defense. So we see like the same logic, for example, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Russia justified the invasion by claiming NATO aggression and possible protection of minorities. These were projected risks and not actual imminent attacks, which is one of the principles mentioned in Joseph Bellum. So once again, preventive war weaponizes said uncertainty and calls it self-defense, creating a political narrative about it and using labels, language, instead of looking at actual threats. So further, for example, we can also talk about how states having kind of a duty for intervention. We can talk about how this can actually be a very imperialist or colonial narrative. For example, where this can be imperialism disguised as protection, right? So who decides who's dangerous, irrational, for example, extremist or incapable, right? It's always the more powerful state. And an example of this can be, for example, the Suez Crisis, where Britain and France intervened to supposedly stabilize, but actually just wanted to maintain control and prevent nationalist powers, right? So another like way of talking about this would be, again, where Russia labeled Ukraine as simultaneously extremist, irrational, manipulated, supposedly by the West, and also at the same time incapable and needing intervention. So how much of like the preventative war can really be about prevention of threat and how much about it is really just to satisfy own interests of other states?
Thank you very much. We're very good. The third speaker, different house.
Yeah, thank you for the floor. So basically the question before us may seem a bit clear cut, I would say at first, but let's rewind this a bit. As basically Professor was trying to say is that in political or even military practice, quite often basically any party, even if it's just the attacker or the defender, would always see the war as just in their eyes, and basically judging the entire argument only based on what I would call sequencing, like you need to be punched first in order to be in the justice side, is not a good argument enough in my view. Then, as Rona was touching on that, basically the state's priority is mainly to protect their own citizens. So if you see the danger growing and see the threat of the imminent attack, then basically is it more moral for you to just stand by and let your own citizens die, or basically you're gonna play a bit of a victim on your part as well? And regarding this, the principles you should have, of course, and they should have them, but unfortunately are principles that kind of useless in case you are dead. So of course you can't have any principles in that regard. Also, our entire plan is not just to say, build an absolutist position that that every single preventive war or label as preventive war is just, we are not trying to get into that absolutist positions. Our main argument is that if certain conditions are met, if the threat is rising, if, for example, there are no other peaceful solutions at a table, in that case, we think that war could be considered as just. So basically, I would frame it that the question in front of us tonight is not if, let's say, whether war is tragic or not. It is always tragic, but the real question is whether waiting is always more just than just, let's say, acting in this regard. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The very speaker.
Thank us for having. Thank you for having us. We are very happy to share a position on peace here, and we're also very happy to share a fundamental principle with the opposing team. The concept of an etiology of war, an etiology of war as a narrative. We completely coincide with Ken and Ferguson's take that war is a story. And then where their mistake occurs is that their story has fallen prey to a very specific rhetorical device. For them, the concept of a preventive war, entirely justified for imperialist ventures, is to them more legitimate than other consumptions. We believe, friends, that this is where they have fallen for the lie of this justification of violence. For us, the very essence of our position is that there are just wars, there are conceptions where we can have tolerance for interruptions of certain actions, but that is only when it is mediated by a defensive response. For example, we must interrupt the chain of violence. It is not, however, reasonable to create a chain of violence or to widen it. We do not understand, for example, how Mr. Sudik says that we can protect our citizens further when we start proactive attacks. When we start with proactive attacks, we've essentially fallen into the phrase that our fundamental thesis tries to reinstate, which is that preventive warfare is to us only proactive violence. It is a justification for, as we've seen it, to exist in preventive warfare in this world, justifications for greater states to attack weaker states. And then when you have this problem of proactive violence, you have the very serious problem of preventing peace. You prevent peace when you try to actually create preventive warfare. It is at the heart of the problem then that preventive warfare actually only prevents peace. Yes.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to move to the most exciting part, which is correct the rebuttal. So yeah, rebuttal session. Do you have the council the privilege to start first? You may proceed.
Thank you to our opponents for making our argument for us. We very much appreciate your agreement that this is a story that is being told. And as a story, it is very difficult to talk about there being an ethical side to one side of war. I have two questions, which I'll get to, but I first want to point out that there is the potential here to confuse an important dynamic of what was always just war theory, which was jus ad bellum, which is why you can go to war, and jus in bello, which is the actions you can take within the war. We're certainly not arguing that there is no justice in war, that, for example, you can kill civilians with impunity. Those rules of morality in war are very important to protect people, to protect the long-term effects of war. Those have developed for a reason. I want to disagree with the last rendition. We're not saying that preemptive war is more legitimate than reactive war or defensive war. We're saying it's exactly as legitimate. Because of the forms that narrative takes, people justify their wars often for reasons that have nothing to do with violence. And they do that whether or not they feel as though they have been attacked first, or they have actually been attacked first. That in fact, that's a narrative construction. And so by recognizing that it is a narrative construction, we need to talk about what just wars are on that basis. My final question to the other side is to point out that in defending the difference between these, you are implicitly supporting what is called just war theory. The Czech Republic has been at war exactly once in its existence. It was part of the occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. That occupation was started by an attack on the United States, thus justifying it under all categories of just war theory through the participation of NATO coming to defend the member state. And under that rendition, that was a perfectly acceptable long-term war against a population and a people that meets all the standards of just war. Do you defend that as a purely just war? Is my question.
Well, our response is that one of the conditions of just war is, of course, proportionality. And when it comes to Afghanistan, it's a very strange example because our response is that we do not see how proportionality applies in response to a terrorist attack on one building to occupying a whole country for 20 years and then leaving it so that Taliban returns. We do not see the criteria of just war being met. But more importantly, so we would like to return the question to the affirmative side. It's basically two questions. First question is whether they are actually aware of what we are talking about, because we have heard the words preemptive, we have heard the words preventive, and we have heard the words intervention, and those three are actually incredibly different. What we are talking here is preventive war. This means striking against a country which is not yet a threat as of now, but you as the attacker believe that it may be a threat somewhere in the future. This is very different from preemptive war. We have heard the affirmative side using the word preemptive, but we are not discussing that because the consensus in international law on preemptive warfare reads that preemptive warfare is accepted as self-defense because it denotes those situations under which you are under a threat of imminent attack and simply strike first. Therefore, the whole point, for example, about Pearl Harbor is not necessarily relevant here because that is about preemptive war. The motion here reads is preventive war just, not preemptive, not anything else. So we are talking about those words which are based purely on speculation. So therefore, our first question to the affirmative side, how do they reconcile this huge issue with the definitions? Our second question is, so what exactly is, let's say, a moral framework to evaluate justice in this debate from their side? Like, we are fully ready, even in the worst case for us, concede that the just war may not be the best idea. We are ready to defend it, but even if they prove that just war is not the best idea, we still have given you a human rights-based example of why preventive war isn't just, and we have given you a whole consequentialist framework on why preventive war isn't just, whereas we show that should we accept preventive war as just, it would lead to a far more horrible world because it would be far more violent. Therefore, our second question is, which framework is actually the affirmative side choosing, and what are they evaluating the justice of preventive war on, and how is that framework better than anything that we have brought so far? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So on the question of preemptive versus preventative war, does preemptive not precede prevention? If we actually talk about the ability to preempt, it is very much intertwined with prevention. So I'm not sure what the major point was in that discussion. As for the human rights perspective, I agree that, and as Philip said, there is many occasions which is used and justified as a human rights perspective, which is not justified. And we're definitely not trying to give carte blanche to an attacker to use preemptive or preventative war as a justification for intervention under any condition. We've been explicitly clear that there are specific obligations, specific criteria which would only have to be met before that could be necessarily justified. And that is basically that there needs to be a credible maturation of threat where where all other means have failed in terms of preventing an attack. So you need to take a preventative action to preempt an imminent threat. And again, we go back to the theory about the state's fundamental role in the global system is to protect its citizens. So I don't really understand the distinction there that was trying to be made. As for, again, back to the human rights perspective, I think we gave the example of Rwanda, and the lessons learned, again, from the UN of the human rights prevention was that there should have been an attack into the country in advance when the intelligence was there and available. And that is our whole point. That it's very limited in its scope and its application. It does not justify Russia's unjustifiable aggression against Ukraine. It does not justify the current US military actions in Iran. It does not justify the invasion in Iraq in 2003 under the false pretenses of weapons of mass destruction. It does have very limited scope when it is applicable, and that is the fundamental question.
So from our side of the house, we believe that given that we are evaluating the preventive war as some kind of a norm, we are evaluating whether it would be a just norm, let's say, to accept it, even if the affirmative side is supposed to, for example, prove that, okay, there is one perfect example of preventive war being, let's say, a good idea, what we are showing you that on the whole, accepting as a general rule the inherent justice of preventive war would lead to a far worse world. And I will leave the space to my second speaker to illustrate how the world will be far worse off under preventive war.
So I would like to say, for example, there can be an instance where one state can perceive danger and another state can also perceive danger from that same state. And both may want to strike, both may want to take a preventative measure, which creates symmetric incentives to attack first. And this kind of dynamic can really help drive escalation. And this was what happened before World War I, where the fear of future disadvantage resulted in mobilization that happened too early, and that, of course, accelerated catastrophe. So my question would be, is in this type of scenario where we have the symmetric incentives from both states, what exactly is the solution here?
And continuing what I earlier attempted to say was specifically on this point of justification via preventive warfare. There is an asymmetry of information when the state acts against another state. And then my question is, has the other side realized in their glee for war that there is more than a single prerogative and more than a single tool for a state to act towards another state? So, for example, in the Iraq conflict, the question of the weapons of mass destruction, is there an institution in the entire world that has the capacity to organize an inspection of weapons of mass destruction and perhaps diffuse the situation? Or is this reaction always and everywhere war? When does it stop?
Yes, to perhaps just add specific examples to what my co-speaker has said, and it's important to realize that given this asymmetry of information and the justification of preventive war for states to just attack each other if they consider themselves as threats, in a world where preventive war is justified, now North and South Korea have all the reasons to go into war already because they do perceive the opponent as a threat. So do Ethiopia and Eritrea, the African continent. So do all the countries which currently feel some hostilities and may feel threatened by their adversaries' opponent. This is what preventive war justifies. For example, is Israel justified in displacing hundreds of thousands of Lebanese civilians just because it feels threatened? This is the issue we see with the preventive war, and this is why we believe that it is never justified.
Yeah, I think I would, to where is the line? Well, that's a good point. Where is exactly the line? But on one hand, I really agree the argument, the absolute argument that is never really justified in this regard. Again, we are not taking absolute position over here, and we are saying they have been basically wars which we could consider preemptive wars, which were really fully justified, but there was not simply enough evidence. But our argument overall, as I'm saying, is that if you're as a state and you see the threat rising on the opposing side, and this might be like or that situation, in that case, you have to react. Otherwise, it might be quite fatal for you. Also, for example, in a bit of a street fight, let's say, most likely if someone threatens you with a knife, you don't really want to wait until they throw you the first hit with that knife. In that case, it will be a fatal mistake for you.
States do not go to war easily, though they sometimes seem to. They do so usually and successfully by building that story. And when we look at recent wars, when we look at historical wars, going back thousands of years, we actually see them building that story again and again in order to make it seem like a defensive war. That is, wars start. They start often, they end badly, and they do so for reasons that the people going into them think are completely legitimate. You would not have the cascading catastrophes of, say, World War I if everyone wasn't convinced that they were being defensive and they were in the right. So this idea that there's a right way to do war and a wrong way to do war is repeatedly a category mistake. Just incidentally, for those of you, one of the categories that we were told was evidence and accuracy. For those of you who are going to vote on a quantitative measure, which I hope you do not do, I would point out that 3 buildings were attacked in the United States at one.
And finally, I want to just query why they would bring up North Korea and the South Korea Peninsula, when actually North Korea provides a prime example of when preventative war could have been justified. If we look at the nuclear program of North Korea in 2006, once they cross the nuclear threshold, there is no going back. There is no way to stop a belligerent state in the global system when they cross that nuclear threshold. And I bring a counter example. The following year, something that most people are probably not aware of, in 2007 in Syria, there was Operation Outside the Box in Al Kabir, which involved Israeli strike on a confirmed nuclear facility that was basically enriching uranium outside IAEA inspections. In the anticipation of using a nuclear weapon, Israel conducted a preventative strike, and nobody heard about it because it was effective.
So firstly, to clarify regarding the Olympic analogy with the person threatening you with a knife, yes, that's preemption. That is a very different thing from what we are talking about. What is prevention? Suppose that you meet a stranger on the street and you think that that stranger in a year may buy themselves a knife with which they might attack you. Striking them under such an assumption is prevention, is what we are talking about. That is, of course, not just. But regarding the fabrication of stories, we cannot simply buy that all wars are justified just by stories and therefore there's like no difference. The crucial issue to distinguish between preemptive wars, which is considered self-defense, for example, and between prevention done under the speculation, is that there are actual material reasons to go to the self-defensive war. And that material underlying is the fact that your nation is getting attacked, your civilians are getting slaughtered. That's where self-defense comes to. However, when it comes to the preventive war, there's no material underlying that there may be, that there's no material threat. Actually, there's only a speculation. That is why we cannot simply consider all causes for war the same fabricated story. No, self-defense has material backing. Preventive war is purely speculation.
And furthermore, to talk about the strikes based on tensions and worry about possible nuclear issues. For example, a really good one would be with the Cold War, where deterrence was used very effectively from both countries that had very good reasons to see a threat from the other, and that was done very well. We avoided a nuclear catastrophe, and both states, one would argue, would be more proportional than the example used.
That's very good. And going back to examples, we care about actually existing preventive warfare. In Latin America, it has been specifically abused, and that really matters to us is the principle that, Kenneth Ferguson, this is my personal question, what is justice in this context? Because, for example, Latin America all throughout has tried to act in a sovereign way that has interpretatively threatened the interests of the United States of America. Because preventive warfare exists in such an interpretative factor, then Latin America, once it goes against the interests of this state, should be attacked. Is this just? Is it just to allow people to act sovereignly only if the consent of the third man is present? Do we need to ask the man in Washington about this debate too?
Thank you for that question. I would point out that the implications of the other side's argument is that the aggressor in any case is allowed to define the terms of reaction themselves. That is, who do you trust? And I will ask anyone on the opposing side, who do you trust to say this is a material reality as opposed to a speculation? Are there world leaders who can actually make that difference? Is there a mechanism by which that can be determined? Certainly we have tried to create those ever since past 120 years, since Woodrow Wilson suggested the League of Nations. The idea has been, let's have an independent body that can make those decisions. That has not stopped war. We continue to have wars. And again, in terms of the wars, the populations of those countries feel that they are justified. If the point of the war is, have we been materially attacked? That argument is made repeatedly. And you are asking us to trust the people who want to go to war to make that determination. That's the problem with just war theory. It's also the problem with trying to differentiate these in that particular way.
Thank you. And then now just to deal with some of the specific examples that were raised and how that ties into exactly reinforcing our main point, which is that there is not a carte blanche for preventative war being just. Our objective here is to tell you that under specific defined circumstances, when it's a last resort option, that it can be justified. And again, to go back to what they said, it has to be with the idea of proportionality involved, and the threshold has to be met. So if we talk about Ethiopia or Eritrea, there is no ways in which that would be justified. There is no existential threat to either party in that case. There is no imminent threat to either party in that case. We talk about Israel and Hezbollah. Once again, there's been an ongoing conflict for many years. And so in that case, it's not really a prudent example because this has been an ongoing conflict for many years. So we don't want to deal in absolutes. We want to define that there is specific examples in which case preventative war is just. And in that case, it doesn't give states the opportunity to use it as justification for any sort of offensive action.
Also just Fabian, because I have 17 seconds. Also one more notion about this hit. Quite often, if you allow your opponent to strike first, quite often you are not the one who is dictating the pace of the conflict itself. Therefore, you will be most of the time in the disadvantage, at least in the early stage. Thanks.
I do. Perfect. So regarding the question whether we should consider preventive or just when there is an example under specific conditions. The issue with creating perfect model scenarios for both of our sides is that the affirmative side can create a perfect model scenario or can find a perfect scenario in which preventive war they can call preventive war just, and then we can do the same and create the perfect scenario in which we will call preventive war unjust. And how do you as the audience then decide? This is precisely why we are bringing to you also the quantitative calculation that accepting preventive war as just is a bad idea, because perfect examples are available on both sides, but we need to evaluate preventive war also holistically to see whether its acceptance will have good impact on the world, and we see that it will not.
Exceptions don't violate the principle, so generally we can argue, again, as a generalized concept, that preventive war is not tolerable because the ultimate effects that it has is a more destructive, more violent world. We're trying to avoid that. Furthermore, we must hammer this down. This is a false binary. The only choices a state has isn't bomb an infinity of children or perhaps get bombed. It's simply not true.
And to return to Professor Ferguson's point about who do you trust? Well, here we are precisely not telling you to trust a politician that says that somebody may become a threat at some point. We are saying to you, trust your very own eyes. When you see Russians build up in 2022 on the Ukraine's border, then we see you do trust your own eyes and presume that Ukraine has a right for preemptive strike should it decide to go for it in that time. However, preemption is still not what we are talking about. We are saying, yes, do not trust the narratives created to justify wars because somebody may pose a threat in the future. That is preventive war. Do not accept preventive war.
And finally, most likely talking about the argument of who to trust, who is allowed to build this narrative, etc. The most important thing is to look at the victims themselves or neighboring countries and not third-party intervenings such as the US. And of course, just to kind of reiterate the point about specific examples, when making or attempting to make a global legal framework, you cannot be using specific examples that fit a certain party. You need the framework to be able to be applicable to everyone.
And just to quickly piggyback off that, in the context of the injustice of war and your skepticism about war, then why do you insist and maintain the position that your general group, Dr. Ferguson, holds, which is war is actually equally unjust and just in different moments? Why are you not simply opting for peace whenever possible, sir? We love peace.
The term is over.
Okay.
But you can.
My argument is that the description of the wars is a narration. It is a story, it's a genre. And in fact, thinking that there are just wars, arguing as this other side is doing, that there are just wars, makes one complicit in the idea that these wars are good for the world, that they're ones that must be done, that they are blessed by God. That's the history of just war, and that's what the other side is arguing for.
Thank you very much. Now for the exciting part is the Q&A from the audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hands.
Thank you. So also to you, Professor Ferguson, what I don't understand, I understand your argument saying, well, the categorization of war, more just, less just at all, it doesn't even exist, is kind of the problem, and I do agree with that. But I would still argue, if the question is preventive war just, and you sit on the affirmative side saying yes, isn't your argument, don't you sit on the wrong side there?
My argument is that it is as just war. That is, the things that just war theory is about, which is a interesting confusion between justice and justification, are equally applicable to both kinds of warfare attacks. I think they both need to be equally questioned. But it is exactly as a just war.
This question is just, which you would answer probably with no.
The reason I started off saying that this question is drawing on this almost 2,000-year history of just war theory is that the question, is this war just? It has these particular parameters and these histories. We can't talk about war being just without referring to those. Thank you.
Just a second. There is a response wanted to be added by the other side. We have
I always pass the microphone to the other side. I got stuff in that. We have shown from the first speech why preventive war doesn't fulfill even the criteria of just war, and then we have brought other criteria to judge its justice on. So let us just quickly reiterate why preventive war doesn't fulfill the just cause jus ad bellum criteria. There's first the necessity of a just cause, such as re-establishing a just peace. Again, what is the motivation to undertake to wage a preventive war? It is because you feel that there somewhere may one day arise a threat that may actually decide to attack you. But even if we suppose fiction of two states, the land of red caps and the land that's called we wish to kill all the red caps, that even at such a situation, there's still years and years before the final war where the country of red caps can undertake deterrence, diplomacy, and an incredible amount of other measures to avoid waging preventive war. So no, preventive war is not just war.
Thank you for this clarification. I would like to move on with further questions.
I have two questions for the both side, but first thing first, I'm going to ask for the affirmative side. You mentioned about the Israel attack towards Syria to stop the nuclear enrichment and against their nuclear facility. Well, Turkey didn't attack them, which is a historical rival for the Syria. Gulf countries didn't attack them, or Saudi Arabia also didn't attack them. Why specifically Israel did attack them? Because it is political. I mean, the very nature of the war and the decision-making mechanism of the war, if it is political, how we are going to blame Russian to attack Ukraine, because it is also preemptive war, because they are trying to stop the expansion of the NATO. So if it is political, how can we talking about it is just or not? And my second question towards to the negative side, I suppose the first speaker mentioned about that we should consider war as a holistic process for the whole humankind. And at the end, you perfectly mentioned about it is creating human tragedies. So holistically, it is bad. I think it is your argument, right? The thing is, we have a whole literature, thanks to the war, we develop modern state education and the whole other institution, which is fallacy theory. So the material reality right now is speaking differently from your moral perspective. So how can we put a limit, development or just? Which one is? Because we invented internet just because of the Pentagon. I mean, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So as for the question around Syria, do we not have a framework for monitoring the systems that we have in place to prevent nuclear apocalypse? We do. It's the Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1970, and there's 9 nuclear countries in the world, 5 signatories to that, 4 are not. And the only one that crossed that threshold following the 1990s was North Korea. And so if we look actually at Syria as an example, there is justification given that they were actually multiple times found to be operating outside the guidelines set in that agreement at the UN, which again dictates the scope of rules to ensure that no state can get a nuclear weapon. And it includes allowing IAEA inspectors, which are neutral party on behalf of the UN, to ensure that the state is not developing a nuclear weapon. So in that case, you can see clearly that there is a distinctive link between breaking of that line between the inspection process existing within the framework that is set out to a response. And so it doesn't matter exactly which state carried it out. It may be unpopular because it's Israel, but any state in the region has a justifiable concern of an Assad regime going outside the bounds of the IAEA and the NPT set about at the UN.
To add, I don't know, but I was going to answer the question there. So if I understood you correctly, you're asking, you're basically talking about how war created a lot of good things for humankind.
World being less.
Okay. But then again, you can't really argue only war. You can argue a lot of issues, shall we say, conflicts created things that are really used today. For example, oh my God, like we can talk about the slave trade. We can talk about the slave trade specifically in Prague. If you ever go to a fantastic class called International Relations on the Map by Dr. Romanzov, he will tell you all about how in Prague specifically, why the city became quite rich many years ago, was because it was one of the main centers in Central Europe for slave trade. So of course, then the city grew as it did, the country grew as it did. So, you know, you can say a lot of things here, but I don't know how much you can really go with that argument, because you can say practically anything has led to. My God, you can talk about the Ottoman Empire. You can talk about the Golden Age. They had their own slave trades, wars, conflicts, and moral issues.
Which just inspires us to reiterate our position about how perhaps a slave uprising would be a just war. We want to clarify this. However, a just war is defensive because it interrupts or reacts to the chain of violence. By definition, the proactivity in these preventive wars could therefore, this is so simple, a tautology, and I must insist on this, never, because of this tautological, a preventive war could be defensive because you are on the aggressive aspect. You're on the wrong side. You're the one starting this violence. And so by definition, the prior definition that we've established, a proactive war cannot be defensive. It cannot be just. We have to stop this. We love peace.
Thank you. Another question?
I want to ask a question to the affirmative house using your own argument. Not really argument, but your stance that you said that the war in Ukraine, so Russian invasion in Ukraine, does not fall into the category of preventive war because it is an invasion and invasive conflict. I've come to think of it that the Ukrainians themselves did not threaten Russia in any way or capacity. This was just a justification made up to intervene into a country. But also, we can obviously say that and agree on that each nation, each country defines, and each country leadership defines justification for the war and threats for this country differently, according to their political, let's say, views and so on. So one can say this threat is exactly Ukraine, and another could say the threat is NATO. But we saw the existence let's say, peaceful existence of NATO forces and Russia on the map for many years, and that of course started just when there was this justification used for Ukraine, specifically. Well, the question is, do you... Okay, the question is, could you explain why do you think exactly, using this particular example, that Ukrainians did not pose any threat to Russians, that this war is still, why this war is not preventive?
Thank you for the question. It was really rightly framed. I need to add in this case. So first of all, you are correct in the assumption that every state sees the threat differently in this case, and I don't think we have any sort of a something that we can objectively, let's say, dispute this fact if they see it from the political reasons and stuff like that. Like, let's say the Russians see the NATO, they are like encroaching on it and whatever. On the other hand, saying that we still have some objective measurements, how to see that. So, for example, I'm not aware, for example, if the NATO was massing their troops along the border, for example, preparing to invade Russia. In this case, we've seen it other way around, of course. So I think even though it's up to the interpretation some part, on the other hand, we have sort of objective measurements to that, like the satellite imagery and stuff like that. So the Russia was already massing its troops on the border, it may not the other way around. Which also brings us a bit of an interesting sort of connection what, let's say, the other party was saying, like if Ukraine should have struck the Russians when they were massing the troops. I mean, in this case, I would say yes. Unfortunately, they do not have really the capabilities to do so during the time, which brings us to another thing. Why some states don't strike the other states? Well, simply, they don't have the capacity quite often. Yeah.
The negative house wants to add a comment to the question.
Firstly, very briefly, let's point out a contradiction. Here we just heard that it actually is possible to deduce and to actually be able to verify when there is a military buildup and a reason for self-defense. Is that contradict what we have heard about that all wars are just stories that we agree to tell each other and something? So do note that the affirmative case is starting to slowly fall apart, and I pass it.
Right. I couldn't agree further, friend. Respectfully, and I do mean to be very respectful, if one listens for a second to the affirmative house, one can see the very confusing, convoluted justifications for more or less wanton violence. The elephant in the room has just been addressed, and I would like to continue with it. Is Vladimir Putin's policies, are they just? Are the policies of Henry Kissinger, are they just? Are the policies of Persian Emperor Xerxes, are they just as well? We stand very simply and directly that they're not. The side says yes. We don't really understand why yet.
Would you like to comment against it?
I'll just say very briefly, we have never argued that it is just a story. It is a story. It is a narrative, but the world is driven by narratives. And, you know, whatever the results of this particular debate are, I do hope that in the future, when someone is coming to you as a decision maker, as a citizen, as a voter, and saying, well, this has to be done, this war has to be entered into. The proper response is not, is it just or not? But what is the story you're telling me about this? Why you want this to happen? And what kind of justice and justification are you building to have that?
Also, just to respond to that part, if let's say Vladimir Putin would be justified to do so. Again, we are not trying to take the absolutist position like the other parties kind of trying to suggest over here. No, we are not trying to say absolutist position, and we are not, or crying out loud, not calling for, let's say, war on every single country that we have some sort of a potential reason to go war with. No, we are not saying that definitely in this regard. We are just saying, like, yes, on one part, I would argue with a question to some part, it is up to the interpretation. But on the other part, there are some objective measurements in this case when you would need to take a preventive action as well.
And I'll just add, it goes back to our core premise when we're talking about the geopolitical realities, it's that there's a specific outline or guidelines of objectives that need to be met for criteria such as that there are the grave imminent threats, that non-military means are failing, and that not acting will increase the chance of a decisively poor outcome.
Further questions?
A question to the affirmative side. I think I heard two different opinions, and like someone said that the US invasion of Iraq and the occupation for 20 years was justified, and someone else said that it was not. So I was wondering, what's your, like, as a team, what's your stance on that?
I'll say very clearly, under just war theory, it was 100% justified. In fact, the UN agreed on that. The Czech Republic entered into it along those lines. That is to say, the question of whether a war meets the criteria of the just war standards is not any kind of measurement as to whether or not it's a good war, it's a wise war, it's a long-term benefit to the world. Though that is not what just war, it's what just war theory pretends to be about, but it isn't.
So to the affirmative side, you didn't really resolve the problem with the difference between the terms preventive and preemptive. So is there a difference, and does it change your argument if there is? And maybe even for the other side, isn't there a very thin line between preventive and preemptive that depends on the subjective arguments or subjective argumentation?
Could you clarify your question to our side?
Preventive and preemptive. Is there a difference in your opinion?
I mean, I gave my opinion before. I think preemptive precedes prevention, or prevention precedes preemption. So, they're, as you said, to the other side, there is a very thin line, and I think they're very interrelated concepts.
A very unexpected result of this debate required that it has students who are schooling the professors about international law regarding the difference of preemptive and preventive war. Why do we believe it's not a thin line? And that, again, we have briefly touched on that, is that preemption comes when there is a material threat. And it is always in the current day and age that the material threat is present and visible, because attacks currently cannot be conducted just out of nowhere. To get ready for an attack, you have to conduct a tedious military buildup. We have seen the US building up its army in the Gulf region for a few months before striking on Iran. We have seen Putin building up his army for a few months before striking on Ukraine, and so on. In the modern age, you have to amass an army first, and that kind of serves as the burden of proof for the preemptive war that there is the credible danger. When it comes to preventive war, however, there is no military buildup to speak of. It is only done because you believe that there may be someday the buildup in a few years not credible.
The official definitions of both talk about, specifically, if you talk about one of the principles, part of it is about the existence of evidence of an attack from the other side, which would then allow you to act in self-defense. That would be preemptive. That is not what we're arguing here. We're talking about preventive war. That is different. That is when we're talking about that is when we're talking about a state thinking that there may be a threat in the future.
Wait, over time? Any questions to the negative house specifically?
Thank you. So I think I have to play the devil's advocate here. Ask the negative side one question. When you're talking about the evidence, where do you put the point where the evidence becomes the evidence of not just a military buildup in the future, but a real threat in the next few days, for example? And who assesses the evidence? Who says that there is really a threat, and it's not just our military intelligence showing us some files to give a casus belli for this attack? Because otherwise, if someone independent assesses the reality of the threat, there might not be enough time to, let's say, attack and prevent the threat. Please.
So I think there's two separate things that are happening in the process of the military buildup, and there's two separate interests we are talking about. Because firstly, there is the country itself, who is not necessarily interested in acting just, right? It wants to ensure its own survival, and then there's the international community and the let's say the public sector, which is concerned about the question of justice itself. And so there are two questions who are solved and addressed by very different actors. When it comes to, for example, the country itself, who makes the judgment whether this is preemptive or preventive, of course, it's always going to be the country itself, yes, but because it acts only in its self-interest. But when it comes to us, the internet or the international community, who in the end should be the arbiters of justice, we say that we have time to evaluate whether it was necessary or not.
The affirmative also has a comment.
And I would just like to thank the questioner and bring back the example of the Rwanda genocide. We saw 3 months in advance of the genocide a credible warning given, and it was not believed because they thought it would only be preemptive. However, it would have prevented a genocide.
Is there another question for the negative house?
All right, can I have a question for both? Okay, cool. I'll start with the negative then. I'm struggling a little bit with identifying any unique moral or legal argument against preventive wars. So I think you used necessity, for example, as one of the arguments, but that argument is not unique to preventive wars. It could be equally applied to defensive wars. And striking second does not make any military action inherently moral or justified, right? So could you highlight a single moral or legal problem that's entirely unique to preventive wars? Because if we're talking just about credibility of evidence, then you're walking a very thin line between prevention and preemption. And for the affirmative team, I have a question. So I think you're struggling a little bit with separating the concept and the practice of preventive wars, right? And I think you've been mostly talking, the vast majority of your arguments were about the concept. Fair, but how do we reconcile with the reality of what these wars, preventive wars or preemptive wars are being labeled, in practice, what track record they have in upholding the principles of just war on average compared to defensive wars? Thanks.
Well, the first speech was full of moral and legal arguments, right? Because we have firstly, it's important to clarify that we don't need a unique argument for each phenomenon that we encounter in the real world. Otherwise, we would be bogged down in endless moral arguments about literally every single thing. We are concerned about finding some applicable moral rules that pertain not only, that pertain also to preventive war. That is what we are doing here. That is how we are trying to justify or not justify preventive war. We have brought the human rights argument, how it infringes on human rights. We have shown how just war shows that it is unjust, and we have given you also the consequentialist, specifically rule consequentialist argument for why preventive war is unjust, in that it creates a fundamentally more violent, dangerous, and worse world.
It's my understanding that the question was more that a unique definition as opposed to a unique historical example. But to answer the question addressed to us, they both have terrible track records. Preventive wars have unintended consequences. They result in death and destruction, as do just wars. The idea that one of them is legitimated by its consequences or its practices is not held up by historical exams. So my point is, our point is, judge them on their own rights as opposed to whether or not a philosophical category can be built around them to say, this war is good, that war is bad.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
So this is a question that is directed for both sides here. I don't think we quite established what the definition of war is, because I know there's been a lot of discussion on what exactly. So from the affirmative side, it seems to be that airstrikes, limited airstrikes, constitute war, whereas I think the negative side is more focused on larger scale operations. Obviously, there's a lot of hostile actions that we can do, so we could say that espionage is a form of warfare and can be preventative, or we can go all the way up to full-out nuclear war as a form of preventative warfare. So what is our definition of war? for either side?
We operate on the most classical definition of organized violence between two states, sovereign or individual states. That's more or less it. But I believe that the heart of the problem when it comes to why we've gotten so confused is that unfortunately a side has to operate in the rather riddles to clarify their position. Why? Because the lack of clarity of what that violence constitutes and where it originates. We simply believe that when I've been hacked. One state, uncalled for, attacks another, that is an aggression. That is not a just war. That cannot be a just war, because when two states have initiated a violence against one another, it is the one at fault that started that violence. That is why, for us, it is so essential to limit the definitions to war as interstate violence and then just war as defensive violence, not proactive. That is it. That's so simple. Mike's.
I would say, just on the example of the airstrikes, it is not necessarily in and of itself a war between two states. However, did it prevent a future war over nuclear weapons? Quite possibly. So then it becomes a philosophical argument. Is it a preventative war preventing an actual war, potentially, without having the full-scale conflict that we see? Do we need by necessity to have a full-scale conflict before we can act in a preventative fashion?
I would point out as well that our colleagues on the other side were very happy to include ideas of like the organized international slave trade or imperialism as forms of war. They are violence against the people. And as such, we need to that they've just excluded that by saying that they're between two states, but those are acts of war.
All right, the microphone is on again. One last question.
So I have a question for Negative House, and I do agree that there's perfect scenario like for any kind of approach, and even it's like a very unique case, but does it imply that we can just simply combine all of them into a label that all preventive war are simply unjust? And I have first like a premise question. So do you agree that either Israel or US strike on Iran's nuclear plan is preventive war? Because development of the nuclear plan is seen as development military capability, so it's not considered as an imminent attack, so it's not really additive war, right?
Of course, yes, we agree. You get it back now.
And also,
Wait.
we have the perfect examples. Yes, but all of the examples in the end have a common denominator, which the preventive war is. Yeah. And if we have both sides which can show their perfect example, we simply are forced to create a general rule, and we have shown why the general rule should be that preventive war is unjust.
And then this evident unjustness is also manifest in the fact that more or less every preventive conflict somehow escalates into a preemptive conceptual full war. And that is where we believe that the issue comes from. I'll just have to see.
I respect that, but I didn't ask you to develop further, so but that's okay. So it's okay. Okay, so yeah, so it's like either the strike on the nuclear plan is like a preventive war. Consider like nuclear weapon is like we all agree is like if there is a new nuclear power, and especially considering Iran has like multiple records in not being that rational, making sponsoring other countries. Do you think that it will be justified for Israel to strike on Iran's nuclear power, to destroy Iran's possible nuclear power simply because they need to maintain regional nuclear safety?
One key thing to realize about Iran before the war, when the airstrike on the nuclear plant happened, is that there was the previous Khamenei, the previous Ayatollah, who issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons, which was a religious ban, where Iran as an Islamic republic was practically guaranteed not to touch development of nuclear weapons because it was religiously forbidden. It is only now, after the strike, that Iran is incentivized to actually pursue a nuclear weapon. So if we kind of want to talk about minimizing nuclear weapons, it was only this preventive war which incentivized them to develop them.
Iraq, we all know, has been away 2 weeks away since 1999 from developing nuclear weapons. We have to strike. We truly believe that the best way to have safety from nuclear bombs is not dropping bombs on them. Furthermore, they have the sovereignty to achieve and have refined uranium nuclear reactors. You're going against the sovereign, freedom, and frankly, the will of the Iranian people. Okay.
All right.
And also, really, really quickly, you argue about like targeting specifically their nuclear program. However, not only the nuclear program was targeted, civilians were also targeted. So that is clearly a problem.
Moving on to the results. You initially stated that 10% of you believe preventive war is just, to a certain extent 47, and absolutely not 44%. Now I kindly ask for a drum roll. With the affirmative house winning. There it is. The affirmative house has won the debate. Congratulations. Congratulations. Do you want to have a final remark?
All I can say is, this is fun, and I appreciate the people who did this, but we are, I will remind you, talking about the death and destruction of human beings. And there's a lot of people in the world who want us to forget that. Please don't.
Thank you very much. You may enjoy the food that we prepared for you.